Good morning, Peggy. Thank you for being here with us. And again, Barbara, likewise. And Peggy, where are you at?
I'm in France.
France. Oh, wonderful.
In lovely Britain.
Mhm. And Barbara, how about yourself?
I'm in the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Peter, good morning, sir. So good to see you.
Morning, Benny. Good to see you.
Thank you. And Mariana, good morning. Thank you for being here. And Brett, have you met Peter before? I don't know.
No, but we've probably responded to this emails from and to one another on the IAJS listserv, and I'm kind of familiar with Peter without ever having actually met him, I don't think.
Well, Brett, it's a delight. I've been reading your book, and frankly, I find it thrilling and timely and necessary just to begin with. So I'm excited to connect in this context around your work.
Well, you're telling me that at the perfect moment. You're getting me all hyped for talking about it for the next hour or so.
Okay.
That's awesome. I'm really glad to hear it.
Yeah. I'm going to get this book in front of our students. So,
you know what? Benny shared that was a possibility or was already happening, and I was super delighted because that's kind of the dream of any academic writer, is to have, a course say, oh, we want to, use this book or put it on the syllabus. It's always wonderful.
Yeah. And so Sonia is letting folks in the room. And good morning again, Robert. Thank you for joining us, sir. Peter Rigg, likewise.
Oh, good morning.
Or Joshua.
Hi.
Good to see everyone. And I will go ahead and get started in the interest of timeliness. So I'd like to say welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us for our International Association of Jungian Studies seminar. Our topic today, Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction with Bret Alderman. If you're a member, welcome back. If you've yet to become a member, you can find more information on our website, jungianstudies.net. And a little bit of housekeeping. As we do begin, if you'll please have your microphones muted, that will be supportive. And with regard to how we'll handle questions and the break today, Bret will address that once he's begun. With that being said, I'd like to introduce Bret. Bret Alderman is an author who received his PhD in depth psychology in 2013 from Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California. His first book, Symptom, Symbol, and the Other of Language, explores the linguistic turn and the concept of linguistic reference from a depth psychological perspective. His most recent book, Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction, addresses deconstruction as it appears in the works of Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler as an expression of archetypal disposition. His recent interests include ideological possession, deconstruction, gender, and the interface between psychology and philosophy. And Bret, thank you for joining us today. And with that, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank everyone in attendance and also thank Benny Harris for his logistical support and moderation. Today, I'm going to speak for roughly an hour, and then we're going to take a little 5-minute break and then come back and I'll finish up with my talk, and that should allow us to have a good half hour or so for questions and answers. Having said that, my presentation today is intended to sketch out the argument I put forth in my recently released book, Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction, an archetypal reading of Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler, which forms part of the Rutledge series, Philosophy and Psychoanalysis. I have a copy of the book right here. I quite love the cover, to be honest. It's Icarus after he has fallen to the ground, having flown too close to the sun. So, I mean, as I just said, my first intent is to present the contents of the argument of this book, but that's only my first intention. I also have another intention, because I want this presentation to serve as a demonstration of how a person might employ a specifically Jungian or archetypal hermeneutics. I want to give a taste of how a person can interpret texts in a way similar to Jung's. Although the idea of a Jungian hermeneutics is not a new one, and despite the fact that Jung spent a great deal of his career in the exegesis of religious texts, Jungian hermeneutics is not generally understood to be an approach of textual interpretation, at least not in the same way that we might think of the approaches of people like Paul Ricoeur, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Richard Kearney, or Jacques Derrida himself. But Jung not only interpreted dreams, he interpreted texts. And more importantly, he interpreted texts as dreams. That is to say, he looked for symbolism, metaphor, parallels in myth and literature. He tracked his own imagination and its response to what he read, just like he might note the images arising in him upon listening to a client's dreams. He used such dream interpretation techniques as amplification to decipher opaque religious manuscripts of the East, as well as Gnostic and alchemical tomes of centuries past. Even scientific texts were not outside the purview of his symbolic mode of interpretation. I would argue precisely because he read them in the same way that he read dreams. He claimed that even a scientific hypothesis can be understood to have a symbolic dimension whenever, quote, we are willing to assume that it purports or signifies something different and still greater, something therefore which is withheld from present knowledge. Interpreting with such a symbolic dimension in mind is an approach that welcomes a poetics of research, and, in the words of Robert Romanician, is, quote, a way of attending to more than just ideas or facts, a way that deepens research and makes it richer by attending to the images in the ideas, the fantasies in the facts, the dreams in the reasons, the myths in the meanings, the archetypes in the arguments, and the complexes in the concepts, end quote. This is an approach that I began to develop in my first book, Symptom, Symbol, and the Other of Language. And I've developed it further in my more recent work, in which I try to discern the symbolic dimension hidden, as it were, in the works of Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler. I look for what these authors might be saying without quite knowing that they're saying it, what patterns they might be expressing without quite being aware of the fact themselves, including patterns that Jungians might call archetypal, that is to say, patterns that are both archaic and typical, patterns that are not only current, but recurrent. As Jung did when looking at scientific hypotheses, when reading Derrida and Butler, I assumed that their works may mean something quite different than they appear to. It's worth noting here that Jung's entire theory of the archetypes would not be possible but for the interpretive technique known as amplification. At its simplest, amplification is a seeking of parallels. Jung, quite famously, spontaneously used amplification when he noted a parallel between, on the one hand, a hallucination of a schizophrenic patient who saw a phallus hanging from the sun, and, on the other hand, an ancient Hellenistic text with a similar motif. It was this observation that got Jung thinking about the existence of archetypes. Could it be that a single motif could express itself in two so disparate, so seemingly unrelated contexts because the human psyche is predisposed to such ideas? Could such a predisposition explain other seemingly inexplicable similarities? Through his use of amplification, Jung would come to find parallels in the most varied sources: myth, fairy tale, poetry, dreams, symptoms, religions, and philosophies. In all of these areas, the intent was always to find, quote, the tissue that word or image is embedded in, end quote. This relentless search for parallels was, in part, a means by which Jung collected evidence for his hypothesis of the collective unconscious. But it also had a therapeutic aim. It was a means of broadening a patient's understanding of their own personal neurosis, so that they might see it as a more general, perhaps even universal affliction, hardly unique to any individual. Amplification, for Jung, was a matter of thinking by way of analogy, and it followed a certain natural logic, inferring from the similarity of forms a commonality of source or lineage. That is to say, in identifying a formal similarity between words, images, symptoms, and motifs, he inferred that they might have a common origin, often one that suggested to him a sort of implicit logic within the human psyche. So what I've described so far gives you a preliminary sense of my method. But what am I applying the method to? What is deconstruction anyway? And who or what is the eternal youth? Because I am speaking to people familiar with Jung's thought, I will presume a certain familiarity with this figure of the eternal youth and not describe it at length, but suffice it to say that Jungians use this term and the term puer aeternus to refer to two different things. On the one hand, it refers to figures to be found in myth and literature. On the other hand, it can also refer to individuals in real life who bear a similarity to these mythic and literary figures. In myth, the eternal youth refers to youths who do not age, like the ancient figure of Icarus from Greek lore, or the more modern figures of Peter Pan and the Little Prince. Often, either they die young, as Icarus did, or they stay forever young, like Peter did. Because they do not age, they are figures of arrested development. Sometimes Jungians will refer to an actual person as an eternal youth type, which is a person who also suffers from a form of arrested development. These are people who fail to mature. They remain adolescent well after adolescence has passed. They cling to attitudes appropriate to an earlier stage of development well after that stage is gone. They have become, in a sense, possessed by the eternal youth archetype. Carl Jung said that, quote, the archetype is a kind of readiness to produce over and over again the same or similar mythical ideas. And it follows that a person under the spell of the eternal youth will produce in his or her own life the same or similar mythical ideas as this mythic figure does. This is the case that I am making regarding deconstruction. I think that it is possessed by the same ideas and follows the same patterns as, for example, the figure of Tristan from the medieval romance of Tristan and Isolde. Or, for example, the figure of Jeremiel from the parodic novel entitled Life is Elsewhere, written by the novelist Milan Kundera. I can't, however, presume the same familiarity regarding deconstruction. Although the term itself has become quite commonplace, perhaps because of this, it conjures different definitions and associations in each of us. For some, it is a careful dismantling of an argument, idea, or narrative that makes us aware of all its latent biases and preconceptions. It is a means to demythologize a text, to reveal its falsehoods and unwarranted assumptions. It is an intellectual style, and currently a very popular one. I would argue that it is also an attitude, a disposition, a psychological pattern, one forever eager to point out the contradictions of accepted wisdom, dispel commonly held beliefs, point out the absurdity of received ideas, and topple every well-established edifice of understanding. It is a mindset that seeks to erode tradition in the name of the new, to undermine norms or normativities, with the often unspoken assumption that to do so is a liberating endeavor. It is a means of dismantling the remnants of the past that are still with us so that we can progress into the future. In its quest to dismantle all prejudices and reveal their corruption, deconstruction points out the apparent arbitrariness and even insidiousness of conventional beliefs. I believe you can hear its echo in every assertion that something seemingly self-evident is, in fact, just a social construct, or just an historical artifact, something quite flimsy and ephemeral, not as substantial or real as one had previously thought. For me, deconstruction is all of these things. Yet, in the strict sense of the word, deconstruction refers to a certain type of philosophical and literary analysis originated by Jacques Derrida. It is a form of analysis often associated with postmodernism and its focus upon language. Postmodernism has borrowed much of its vocabulary from deconstruction, and much of its focus upon the linguistically mediated nature of all thought is a product of the way deconstruction conceives of language itself. Broadly speaking, this focus forms part of the linguistic turn, which is a movement in early 20th century philosophy that addressed philosophical questions as questions about how language works and what humans do with language. Derrida, like Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, and others of their generation, were deeply influenced by the structuralist linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, but also by figures like Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein. Deconstruction has been at the forefront of an anti-essentialist fervor that views with a highly astute and semiotically sophisticated skepticism any talk of essential structures, innate characteristics, or transhistorical human nature. Such structures, characteristics, and natures are, in fact, precisely what it attempts to deconstruct. They are the sorts of fundamentals or principles that Derrida called into question. And in doing so, he called into question the entire heritage of Western philosophical thought. In calling this heritage into question, and doing so in such a radical, totalizing fashion, Derrida helped usher in an age, or the sensibility of an age, that we are still living in, perhaps even without knowing it. Derrida sees this heritage of the West, despite its diversity and despite its evolution, in terms of a single generalized system or schemata with certain sets of assumptions, biases, baggage, and prejudices, all of which reveal themselves to be fictive and duplicitous from a deconstructive point of view. In particular, Derrida sought to undermine any belief in philosophical universals. That is to say, any belief in concepts or terms that are generalizable to other contexts than the ones from which they arose. It is difficult to overstate just how radical his project is. His critique attempts to shake or make tremble, to use his words, the very foundations of Western thought. Because I am talking to an audience interested in Jung, I'd like to emphasize that the word archetype, perhaps more than any other word in the Western philosophic tradition, epitomizes this universalist pretension that deconstruction takes aim at. Deconstructive critics will immediately point out that such things as archetypes, whether they are Platonic or Jungian, are no more than the inventions of a particular philosopher or a particular psychiatrist living at a particular place and time, which in and of itself discredits any pretense to universality. This is, in fact, the nub of the issue, because every idea has a lineage, a genealogy. From a deconstructive point of view, its pretense to any transhistorical or transcultural validity is dubious. A short statement from Barbara Johnson in her introduction to Derrida's book, Dissemination, succinctly states this genealogical approach quite well. Quote, "Deconstruction reads backwards from what seems natural, obvious, self-evident, or universal, in order to show that these things have their history, their reasons for being the way they are, their effects on what follows from them, and that the starting point is not a natural given, but a cultural construct, usually blind to itself." End quote. The quote epitomizes the deconstructive approach, which never fails to argue that what we might assume to be natural or given must, in fact, and by necessity, be cultural, that is to say, something created by humans with no reality beyond the human. Enough said for the moment as regards what deconstruction is. Now I want to focus on a word that exists at the very core of deconstruction, a word that Derrida coined himself. And I want to do this in order to draw a parallel between deconstruction and a certain form of desire that can be found in great works of myth and literature. In other words, I want to demonstrate the technique of amplification. The word is difference. It is a combination of two words in French. One that means defer, as in to put off, to delay, to save till later, and another word that means differ, as in to be different or to differentiate. It would be well outside the scope of today's talk to explain in detail how the idea plays itself out in Derrida's work and all the ramifications that result from it, but I'll try to give you a general sense at least, so that you can discern the parallel that I do. One way of thinking about this central idea of deconstruction is to think of it as the principle of the not yet. Fundamental to the production of textual meaning, as deferral, it alludes to a temporal lag forever at work within language. In other words, it refers to the idea that the conclusive meaning of a word, a phrase, an utterance can never be truly grasped because it is always dependent upon its relation to other words or signs, the meaning of which cannot yet be fully known. The full meaning of any text or any spoken utterance is always subject to postponement. Every time we ask what a word, a sentence, or an entire text means, we can only respond with reference to other words, sentences, and texts, which themselves are subject to similar postponement. What this means is that interpretation is always provisional. The meaning that we are trying to get at eludes us, or as Derrida says, the thing itself always escapes. I'll come back to that idea in a few minutes, but it bears repeating. The thing itself always escapes. Put differently, meaning always eludes us. This elusive meaning is what Derrida calls the transcendental signified. In his words, quote, every time you try to stabilize the meaning of a thing, try to fix it in its missionary position, the thing itself, if there is anything at all to it, slips away. End quote. This is at first glance a rather simple idea. If you are reading a book and feel that you have fully understood the preceding paragraph, or if you feel that you have not, the light cast by the paragraphs, pages, and chapters to follow will inevitably throw a different hue upon it. It will come into greater or lesser focus and reveal meanings that are not apparent at present. Words will acquire different connotations as they come to be used in other contexts. You will revise or abandon assumptions. Repeated examinations of the text will reveal different meanings, allusions missed, and metaphors that were not recognized as such. Words that seem odd will grow familiar, and what feels familiar will come to feel foreign. Inferences that you could not possibly have made upon first reading will appear obvious in hindsight. Difference, as deferral, alludes to the fact that the full meaning of the recently read paragraph, with every possible connotation and denotation having been recognized and explored, is an impossibility. That meaning will never be present. Put differently, it is always not yet present. Therefore, there is a sense in which meaning is always provisional, conditional, and temporary. The decisive moment in which it can be fully adjudicated simply never comes. There is always a step yet to be taken before we arrive at the receding horizon that is the definitive meaning of any written text or verbal utterance. What we attempt to convey is forever absent, forever elsewhere, always desired, yet never obtained. The idea of a perpetual absence of something desired, as will become apparent shortly, has a long lineage and has been called by many names. Derrida calls it difference. For him, meaning in its fullness is irreparably lost. Although our longing for it persists, the satisfaction of that longing is forever deferred. But difference does not merely allude to deferral, to a semiotic not yet, forever and always at work within texts. Derrida tells his reader that the term also alludes to a certain differentiation at work within language. Meaning isn't just located in some unreachable future, that is to say, another moment in time. It is also, in a sense, located in another place. What precisely is meant by this is perhaps most easily understood in terms of repetition. Words can be repeated in differing contexts, although their outward form, what you see upon the page or hear, may appear seemingly identical from one instance to another, their meanings cannot. For Derrida, no word, no phrase, no utterance has an identical meaning from one context to another, because contexts change meaning. In this sense, the absolute, unequivocal repetition of a word, of a sign, of any meaningful utterance is an impossibility, because the very act of repetition is transformative. Repetition is transformation, because the repetition of a sign is always dependent upon a spatial gap or temporal interval. It is never quite the same sign twice, much like the repetition of a piano chord will never have the same aesthetic effect if it is played within a different measure of a song, or at another tempo, or within another melody. Contexts, furthermore, continually change. Read a text, a sentence, or a word at one moment, and then read it at another, and its sense will have shifted. It will have been displaced. Because this is the case, the dual aspects of the sign, that is to say, the signifier on the one hand, that's the manifest word that you see or hear, and the signified on the other hand, the concept or meaning that it alludes to, are said to be in disunion. They do not form a coherent, lasting whole, nor a single identity. Put most simply, words and their meanings are split from one another. That is how deconstruction frames it. Now, a person can, using his or her intellect, argue for or against the validity of Derrida's claims as regards the workings of language and the plausibility of his argument. One can point out seeming performative contradictions in his claims. Many philosophers already have, and I have as well. But following Jung's lead, one can also employ the technique of amplification. Following Romanician's suggestion that one can attend to the images and the ideas, the dreams and the reasons, the myths and the meanings, the archetypes and the arguments. In doing so, one can imagine that both difference and the transcendental signified are not what Derrida says they are, or more precisely, they are that and so much more. Following Romanician's suggestion by attending to the images in those ideas, the ideas of difference and the transcendental signified, it is not hard to see that difference names a form of desire, and the transcendental signified names the object of desire. In Derrida's theory regarding the functioning of linguistic signs, he describes a voracious yet ambivalent yearning for what is both absent and unattainable. The image in these ideas is that of unrelenting and unsatisfied desire. The question then that we must ask if we want to draw parallels and amplify the meaning of this desire is, where else have we seen such a desire? Where does it appear in myth, in literature, in dreams, in life itself? One answer comes in the form of a Greek word from antiquity. The word is pothos, which James Hillman describes as, quote, the longing towards the unattainable, the ungraspable, the incomprehensible, that idealization which is attendant upon all love and which is always beyond capture. Pothos, one of many possible manifestations of eros, personifies a particular form of desire, a desire for what is absent. The absence can be temporal or spatial, and the desired object can exist in the past or future. Plato speaks of it in his Cratylus, and it can also be found in Homer's Odyssey. In fact, all Odysseys are imbued with it. As a persistent feature of the Greek tradition, present in the Iliad, the Dionysian trek through Hades in search of Euripides, and Alexander's dream of the conquest of distant lands, it is the relationship between pothos and its satisfaction that forms, quote, one of the most fundamental models for Greek narrative, end quote, according to the critic, cultural critic Tim Whitmarsh. For the purpose of my talk today, most importantly, pothos, the desire for things absent and far off, is also the insatiable yearning that characterizes the puer aeternus and puella aeterna. It is the desire that typifies the eternal youth figure. The two best known writers on this topic within the Jungian tradition, James Hillman and Marie-Louise von Franz, are in agreement on this point. Though the latter does not mention pothos by name, she certainly describes it in her writing. On her account, the eternal youth is always convinced that the important thing, what he deeply wants and yearns for, is always located in some far-off place. Everything about the eternal youth is provisional because he is haunted by the peculiar feeling that he is not yet in real life. In fact, von Franz makes quite a big deal about this. For her, the problem of people who live under the influence of the eternal youth archetype is that they suffer from the neurosis of provisional living. Somehow, for them, the life that they really want is always far off, always in the distance, always elsewhere. It is as far off as the elusive meaning of the transcendental signified. And the provisional living of the eternal youth is, I would argue, just as provisional as is Derrida's provisional interpretation. I think they follow the same pattern. They are different variants of a single mythical idea. But we don't need to limit ourselves to these writers. In Love Declared, Denis de Rougemont, cultural theorist and author of the now classic work Love in the Western World, describes a form of romantic desire that is predicated upon distance. He calls this romantic desire passion. It is a form of desire that is nourished by withdrawals. In order to perpetuate and replenish itself, it must withdraw from the object of affection. The impassioned lover must remain chaste and defer consummation to kindle and rekindle desire's flame. Such a passion is aroused by the wooing of courtship, yet wanes at the blush of its own fulfillment. It eschews carnal knowledge of the other, and if this is perchance attained, it then withers on the vine. Insatiate it thrives, satiate it dies. The beloved must forever transcend the grasp of the impassioned lover, who can only desire the far-off prince or princess, or a beloved made inaccessible by circumstances or prohibition. The yearned-for other must be made distant by the duty of conjugal fidelity, must be too old or too young, belong to an unacceptable ethnicity or social class, or be frowned upon by one's peers. Juliet desires Romeo, and Romeo Juliet because, and not despite, of the distance imposed by the mutual enmity of the Montagues and the Capulets. The more remote the object of affection, whether due to literal or figurative distance, the greater the love. In this regard, passion is, quote, a desire that demands an elsewhere. Because it is predicated upon a lack of literal or perhaps figurative consummation and must remain in some sense virginal, such a passionate love is immature and irreal, knowing little of the reciprocal relation that characterizes true love, on de Rougemont's account. De Rougemont goes so far as to christen what he calls a Tristan archetype. Tristan is, of course, a well-known eternal youth figure, and what defines him and all others who represent such a type is a desire for something that is not present, something that can't be present and must be far off. The case that I am making here is that the claim that the transcendental signified will always and forever remain transcendent is not merely a statement regarding semiotics. It's not merely a statement about how language works. As noted earlier, Jung claimed that even a scientific hypothesis can be understood to have a symbolic dimension whenever, quote, we are willing to assume that it purports or signifies something different than what it appears to, end quote. In a similar vein, Derrida's approach reveals a symbolic dimension if we are willing to look for it. Seen in this light, his claim regarding difference are also claims regarding the human heart. They are veiled, perennial stories in clever disguise, stories inspired by a certain form of desire that, historically, has been associated with youth. Such claims are not grounded or are only grounded tangentially in the logical consequence or the inevitable conclusion of an argument. Derrida's assertion of the signified's absolute difference in distance from the signifier, The assertion that the two, word and meaning, are cleft by an unbridgeable abyss is the consequence of a psychological pattern. The temporal and spatial distance between signifier and signified, word and meaning, language and the things to which language refers is the same distance that separated Tristan from Isolde. It is the distance of every troubadour from every beloved princess. The characters in the story of an insuperable distance have changed their names, but the outlines of the drama remain relative constants. They still tell the tale of the same impossible love, the same desire at a distance known as pothos, and passion by others. I should say, the same distance known as pothos by some and passion by others. To recognize this pattern is to find a myth in the meaning, an archetype in the arguments that make up deconstruction. But this is only one pattern, one parallel. Granted, the idea of difference is the idée fixe, the fixation and obsession around which Derrida's entire work revolves, but it is just one idea. On the other hand, I think that Jung would rightly call it Derrida's supraordinate idea. It is what Jung might have called Derrida's God. To claim that difference is Derrida's God and that he is, in a sense, possessed by it is a bold claim, but it makes perfect sense if we understand, as Jung did, quote, that psychological fact which is present is the greatest, let me read that again. Let me see here. To claim that difference is Derrida's God and that he is, in a sense, possessed by it is a bold claim, but it makes perfect sense if we understand, as Jung did, quote, that the psychological fact which is the greatest in your system is the God, since it is always the overwhelming psychic factor which is called God. From this point of view, gods are akin to supraordinate ideas or reigning principles. And the reigning principle of deconstruction is difference. It is the principle of the not yet, which happens to be the same principle that typifies the eternal youth. Deconstruction recognizes no other dynamic, no other master, no equally important countervailing principles like identity, presence, continuity, and synthesis. Although these principles are acknowledged, they are themselves understood as arising from and being secondary to the non-identity, absence, discontinuity, and divisiveness of difference. Such one-sidedness, such lack of any truly counterbalancing force on Jung's reading is symptomatic of the gravitational pull of the archetype, which renders even the best of us at times, quote, liable to possession by an infatuation, a vice, or a one-sided conviction. But what other principles and parallels might we find if we are willing to look for images and ideas, fantasies and facts, and dreams and reasons? The thematic content of deconstruction lends itself to a reading in terms of the eternal youth, not only in relation to difference and the transcendental signified. The readiness to produce over and over again similar ideas, as Jung claims that archetypes do, is in no way limited to these two terms. On the contrary, similarities are abundant. The deconstruction of textual authority by way of the critique of what Derrida calls logocentrism and a metaphysics of presence, shares an undeniable family resemblance with a certain youthful anti-authoritarianism typical of this mythic character, the eternal youth. The free play of signifiers that, for deconstruction, precludes any definite, fixed, rigid interpretation, and thereby liberates a multiplicity of heterogeneous readings. This too bears witness to the eternal youth's spirit of transgression and desire for absolute, limitless freedom. Neither the eternal youth nor deconstruction are what they are without limitless play. It is so important and central to their outlook. Both also appear to struggle at times with confusion as to play's relation to a world that is not mere play, a world of real-life consequences, subject to certain laws of causality, where empirical truths can be demonstrated or refuted. Both revel in a certain ecstasy, what might be called a pleasure of displacement, that appears to have no limiting principle. Adding to the list, eternal youths are often quite convinced of their own exceptionalism. They are not ordinary people with ordinary talents, although such a belief often resides in simply never having put their talents to the test of time. The eternal youth is there to see within the works of Derrida and those who have followed in his footsteps. The thematic content of the philosopher's writings more than lends itself to such a statement. Its preoccupation over questions of temporality, displacement, presence, authority, limits, and structure are also recurrent issues for puer and figure prominently in the literature about him. All of these themes, in one form or another, are to be found in abundance in Jungian and post-Jungian descriptions of the eternal youth. The very term deconstruction testifies to an attitude towards structure that is resonant with the eternal youth's antipathy to fixity, order, and rigidity. Puer, like deconstruction, strives towards the decomposition and desedimentation, the unraveling and undoing of structures. Derrida's notion of undecidability mirrors the eternal youth's notorious indecision and speaks to their shared desire to undermine binary logic. His seeming reduction of everything to a matter of representation also echoes a theme common to this youth. Even issues of erudite speculation that might seem far afield and unrelated, like Derrida's assessment of Aristotle's thinking on potentiality and actuality, reveal themselves on closer inspection to be yet another iteration of a theme typical of this figure. Making the potential actual is his recurrent insurmountable challenge. It is the motif that forms the eternal youth's existential dilemma. The aforementioned cluster of themes all point in the same direction, to the same readiness to produce over and over again similar mythical ideas. They are the mythical ideas typical of the puer aeternus. Marie-Louise von Franz, in her classic work, The Problem of the Puer Aeternus, returns again and again to a classic from children's literature to illustrate her points. The classic in question is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's book, The Little Prince. If you have read the book, you may remember a scene towards the beginning of the story in which a little boy who has dropped from the sky, a boy who once lived on a far-off asteroid, asks the narrator of the story if he would be willing to draw him a picture of a sheep. The narrator humors the boy and draws various representations of sheep. What becomes clear in the episode is that for the little boy, the drawing of a sheep is just as good as an actual living, breathing sheep itself. Von Franz uses the anecdote to further her argument and description of the eternal youth type. On her reading, one of the eternal youth's maladaptive responses to life is the way in which he conflates and confuses the world of consensus reality with the world of fantasy. Another closely related maladaptive response is that he draws action back into the realm of fantasy and theory. In lieu of action, he opts for reflection. He flies into the stratosphere of ideas and imagination. He escapes into the intellect and fantasy, but at the cost of his relationship with the earthlier plane of phenomenal reality. Preemptively, as a defense against the immediacy of perception and feeling, he converts this immediacy into its representation in the form of fantasy or idea. One might say that for von Franz, puer conflates life with its representation and subsumes the former under the latter. He assimilates intellectually that which would best be assimilated otherwise through feeling or action. This form of assimilation results in a dangerous conflation of representation and reality. Like Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince, von Franz tells us, the eternal youth, quote, thinks the design of sheep is as good as real sheep. Everything remains in the world of mental activity. Through this defensive maneuvering, he thinks his way out of the immediacy of living in a world that demands action and one in which actions have consequences. In his avoidance of entering space and time completely, he turns the present into the represented. Put differently, he turns the immediacy of direct perception into representation, that is to say, into ideas, words, images. Turning the present into the represented is in effect, a position that Derrida also arrives at. In his seminal work, Speech and Phenomena, he argues that there is no such thing as perception. In that work, which establishes the trajectory of all the works to follow, he attempted to demonstrate that, quote, the theme or import of pure presentation, pure and primordial perception, full and simple presence, as developed by phenomenology, was untenable. In contrast, Derrida contended that perception does not exist, or that what is called perception is not primordial. Somehow, everything begins by representation. That's an important part to repeat. Somehow, everything begins by representation. And in Derrida's thinking, that means somehow everything begins with language or proto-language. There is, in other words, there is no thing in itself that presents itself to us through perception and is later represented by us through language, not only does perception not exist, it never has. Derrida says, quote, "There never was any perception." In that same work, Derrida argues against the very idea of what Edmund Husserl called the Lebenswelt, the world of lived experience. By his reading, no such world can exist. There is no lived experience, only representations. In making such an argument, real life, raw experience is held at a distance by words. But even that radical formulation is not quite faithful to the deconstructive argument. It isn't just that our experiences and perceptions are shaped or overdetermined by the language that we use. It is the language that we use which instills within us the belief that anything called perception or experience exists as we have thought. Rather, deconstruction undermines appeals to such principles as these, as experience and perception, just as it undermines appeals to things as truth, reality, self, center, unity, nature, consciousness, God, and being. All of these words are, from the perspective of deconstruction, merely false presences. They have no reality beyond the language that names them. The language is just as good, just as real as that which it names. Much like for the Little Prince, the drawing of sheep is just as good as real sheep. The representation of something is as good as that something. Despite the similarities in the accounts of James Hillman and Marie-Louise von Franz, the two of them offer two differing visions of the eternal youth. And where they differ is, first and foremost, regarding who they view as the youth's primary antagonist and who or what is the cause of his arrested development. For von Franz, it is the Great Mother, whose mythic expressions find form in figures like Maya, Ishtar, Cybele, the Virgin Mary, and Kali. For her, the conflict at the heart of the eternal youth's dilemma is a conflict with what might be called the primordial mother. For Hillman, on the other hand, it is the senex, or what I also refer to as the temporal father, that is the primary conflict. This is the aged patriarch, whose mythic forms are, among others, that of Yahweh, Kronos, Daedalus, Saturn, and Zeus. The two interpretations of the eternal youth's fundamental antagonism, one with the primordial mother, the other with the temporal father, do not conflict as much as it might appear. They are merely two aspects of a psychological complex, that is, by definition, complex. These two figures are at the core of the eternal youth's problematic, and they are at the core of deconstructions as well, although this might not be immediately apparent. On Hillman's reading, the eternal youth is, quote, that structure of consciousness and pattern of behavior that refuses and struggles with the senex, time, work, order, limits, learning, history, continuity, survival, and endurance, end quote. This embodiment of the themes of limitation, law, and logic is the archetype that the eternal youth finds himself in conflict with. His temporal dimension is perhaps most clearly epitomized in Kronos, father of Zeus and cruel cannibal of his own progeny. He is the personification of the relentless progression of moments that consume us all eventually, from which we derive the words chronological, chronic, chronology. This is the archetypal image of the eternal youth's problem with time and authority, or perhaps more precisely, it is one manifestation of it, one exemplar of a more general senex consciousness that is, quote, particularly temporal, structuring its vision in terms of the chronic, end quote. These quotes are all Hillman, by the way. Consequently, the eternal youth's displacement in time, his eternal not yet, and difficulty with simple presence in the here and now all correspond, mythically speaking, to a conflict with senex, with the archetype of time itself. The same can be said for deconstruction. It has a conflict with time as well. And Derrida goes as far back as Aristotle to demonstrate how fundamentally flawed the West's conception of time supposedly is. Anybody who has delved into deconstruction deeply enough understands that it is just as much a critique of a particular understanding of time as it is of a particular understanding of language. Writing on the puer aeternus, Hillman notes that the beyond is, quote, the flag under which he sails, whether horizontally beyond or temporally beyond, which lies in the future and demands ever increasing acceleration, or psychologically beyond, that drive to deliteralize, deconstruct, and see through every limiting denotation, every reductive explanation, every barrier of law, logic, and religion. End quote. On this reading, the yen for the beyond forms part of the very same archetypal impulse as the impulse to deconstruct, the drive to discredit intended meaning, and the will to overcome all obstruction of law and logic. If Hillman is correct in this, and furthermore, the parallel that I've drawn between pothos, a desire for things far off on the one hand, and on the other hand, Derrida's semiotic deferral or principle of the not yet is valid, then we would expect to find the eternal youth's antipathy towards limitation, law, and logic at work within deconstruction. In other words, what both the eternal youth and deconstruction set themselves against, the nemeses and specters that they struggle to overcome and defeat, should be akin. They should be similar. They should be akin, and indeed they are. Senex is the principle of order, structure, and abstraction, limits, authority, and borders. He is heavy, leaden, dry, and hierarchical. Not only does this figure represent what is old, but also what is changeless. On Hillman's reading, when Senex is in harmony with the eternal youth, then he appears in the more benevolent, though always ambiguous guise of a wise old man. When he is not, he is the hardening of consciousness, the calcification of habit, the stiffening of the body into the inevitable immobility of the tomb and the eventual stasis of stone. So close to the grave, Senex is grave in mood, and the laws that he confers, etched on stone tablets as well, are equally static, In his hardened form, his morality is a code, often void of spirit or love, a law without mercy, inflexible in principles too firm and entrenched, too unalterable and immutable. When divorced from the eternal youth, the image of the senex is that of tradition in need of renewal and patriarchal authority grown authoritarian. When this is the case, senex represents oppressive laws built on spurious foundations and ossified tradition with scant relevance to the present. As the image of the past divorced from the present, he is the mythic embodiment of a heritage that is little more than an antiquated set of prejudices, arbitrarily and unjustly imposed, much like the metaphysical heritage that deconstruction seeks to dismantle and discredit. I'm wondering if this might be a good place to take a little break. It's been, I think, roughly an hour. Does that feel all right, Benny?
Yes, it does. Yes, it's been a little more than an hour.
Okay, perfect. And then I'll continue with Marie-Louise von Franz, and eventually I will bring in the other central thinker, which is Judith Butler.
Okay, and we're going for 5 minutes. Is that
That feels good for me, assuming it's good for others.
okay? Let's come back in 5 minutes or just about 20, almost 20 after the hour.
That sounds good. Great.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Ready to go?
Yes, sir, as we will all make our way back. Thank you.
So I left off talking about the figure of the senex, or what I call the temporal father, father time. But what about mother? Marie-Louise von Franz had a different reading of the eternal youth figure than did Hillman. For von Franz, it is the great mother that is the problem for the eternal youth. For her, the eternal youth has an ambivalent attachment to mother. He has a mother complex. This is what keeps him too young for too long or leads to premature death. On von Franz's reading, one characteristic of eternal youths, as mentioned earlier, is that they tend to live in the realm of idea and fantasy. Symbolically, this is often represented by figures who live in the sky and not on the earth. An eternal youth, in his desperate attempt to flee mother, says von Franz, escapes into the intellect where generally she cannot follow him. He flies into the stratosphere of ideas and imagination, but at the cost of his relationship with a more earthly plane. Put differently, eternal youths tend to cut themselves off from the material world. This last statement brings me to a key element in my reading of deconstruction through the lens offered by von Franz. It is the peculiar relationship that deconstruction has with matter itself. I think it is more than mere coincidence that both of the terms mother and matter derive from the Latin cognate mater. And this derivation can be traced back farther to the Indo-European family of languages, which includes Hindi, as well as many other languages throughout Europe and Asia. There is a widespread correlation between the words for mother and the words for matter in most of the languages that belong to the Indo-European family. There is a deep etymologic relation between the notions of mother and matter, which suggests that there is also a deep psychological relationship between the two ideas. This relationship cannot be said to exist in only a few different cultures. It is probably a universal association. For some reason, mother and matter are deeply entwined in the human psyche, and drawing a parallel between the two by way of their etymology is an example of what Jung meant by the interpretive technique of amplification. What I want to suggest here, and what I have laid out in greater detail in the book, is that deconstruction's ambivalent relationship with the material world mirrors an ambivalence towards mother. How this ambivalence towards matter manifests in the work of Derrida can be seen in his antagonism towards empiricism, as well as the way in which deconstruction conceives of language, which many critics have pointed out makes it difficult to understand what relationship language might have with the material, objective world that it ostensibly represents. Deconstruction appears to dissociate language from the material world. Given the etymological relation between mother and matter, I think what this all suggests is that deconstruction, like the eternal youth, has mother issues. Having said that, I'd like to introduce another thinker who is a deconstructionist in the broad sense of the word. I am, of course, speaking of Judith Butler. I think the ambivalence towards matter that is present in nascent form in Derrida's work comes to full maturity in her writings. Butler, a philosopher by training, has had an enormous influence on third wave feminism and gender theory, but her cultural impact, perhaps far more than the innumerable citations of her writings, may have less to do with the intrinsic value of her work and more to do with an appeal to a pre-existing desire or imperative. She gives voice to something that was already there, something that sought expression and found its proxy. In this regard, it is less relevant the extent to which Butler draws from Derrida, although this is perhaps the case to a degree often overlooked. What is more relevant is that she is influenced by the same archetypal readiness to produce over and over again the same or similar mythical ideas. Many associate Butler with Michel Foucault, but a deeper reading of her work shows the clear influence of Derrida. Her notion of gender performativity derives directly from Derrida's appropriation and reconfiguration of John Searle's and J.L. Austin's thoughts on the performativity of language. In her book, Bodies That Matter, Butler critiques what she calls a metaphysics of substance, which is a carbon copy of Derrida's critique of what he calls a metaphysics of presence. The book is a sustained attempt to undermine long-held assumptions about both matter and the human body, especially the sexed body as a material object. Butler is a notoriously difficult writer. Her arguments are complicated, equivocal, vague, and often work by way of provocative questions that remain unanswered, although they serve the purpose of creating doubt. Having said that, her argument goes something like this. The human body, the material body, is so entwined with any description of it that we cannot take the body to be an uncontestable given. We can't ever clearly differentiate human bodies and the discourses, the language systems that describe them. Bodies don't exist prior to language, as strange as that may sound. She even goes so far as to claim that sex, quote, does not qualify as a pre-discursive anatomical facticity, end quote. In other words, sex is not a fact of human anatomy that exists prior to or independent of any language that might describe it. Such a form of thought is undoubtedly a legacy of deconstruction, which always claims explicitly or implicitly that language comes first and everything else is secondary. Or perhaps for Butler, it might be more accurate to say that it's a bit of an open question, which comes first, and she exploits this opening to the utmost. In many important ways, Butler's thinking mirrors and mimics Derrida's, whereas the latter figure inverts the relationship of signs and perception, language and phenomena, granting primacy to the former. Butler appears to invert the relationship between signs and the body, also granting primacy to the former, although the primacy is attenuated by caveats, provisos, and equivocations that would seem to make for a duplicitous argument. At times, she appears to argue that representation, that is to say, language, must precede presentation, that is to say, things which are simply self-evident. Though in making her argument, she adds a twist or two, or perhaps even three. The strategy of making the secondary into something primary and the derivative into something constitutive, which is key to deconstruction, plays itself out in Butler's writings in multiple ways, the most important of which is the way that Butler thinks of sex and gender. For second-wave feminists, as Holly Lawford Smith points out in her book, Gender Critical Feminism, sex is a primary reality that exists prior to the secondary reality of gender. Gender is, in this sense, derived from and inseparable from sex, because gender is the cultural, societal elaboration of what it means to be female or male. Sex is the primary reality without which the secondary cultural elaboration of gender would be impossible and would not even make sense. From this point of view, sex and gender are simply two aspects of a single whole. Sex denotes a biological reality, and gender alludes to all of the culturally imbued connotations that we attach to that biological reality. Yet Butler inverts this presumption, claiming that gender may actually be primary and sex secondary. Gender may actually be constitutive and sex derivative. This undermining of the female-male binary takes place by way of what Judith Butler calls a strategic displacement, a phrasing that is commonplace in deconstructive writings, just as it is commonplace for both philosophers, each in their own way, to construe seemingly self-evident binaries as non-evidential. Both tend to understand binaries as machinations of a pre-existent, unfounded intellectual order, one whose very existence must be called into question, interrogated, and found deficient. In the case of Derrida, the intellectual order to be called into question is called a metaphysics of presence, or logocentrism. For Butler, it is called a metaphysics of substance, or perhaps heteronormativity. To give a better sense of Butler's thought and the tone of her writing, I will read a short passage from Bodies That Matter, published 3 years after her groundbreaking work, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. Butler writes, quote, "The body posited as prior to the sign is always posited or signified as prior. This signification produces an effect of its own procedure, the very body that it nevertheless and simultaneously claims to discover as that which precedes its own action. If the body signified as prior to signification is an effect of signification, then the mimetic or representational status of language, which claims that signs follow bodies as their necessary mirrors, is not mimetic at all. On the contrary, it is productive, constitutive, one might even argue performative, inasmuch as this signifying act delimits and contours the body that it claims to find prior to any and all signification." End quote. Anyone hearing this passage should be immediately forgiven for any potential lack of understanding. Even if granted its full context, it's a difficult passage, but I will do my best to simplify it. Typically, we understand the body to be something that presents itself to us and is later represented by us. In other words, because humans are bodies that perceive other bodies, we have words to reflect this fact and words to reflect different types of bodies. In this sense, the body exists prior to the sign, prior to the language that represents it. Language has a mimetic, representational relation to the body, or so it would seem. This has been the classical conception. But for Butler, judging from the paragraph above, it is the passage from body to sign, the process of signification, that produces the body that was thought to exist prior to this passage. What one thought was prior is actually subsequent, an effect, or better yet, an after effect. In rendering the secondary into something primary, the derivative has become something constitutive, an origin. It seems at times that Butler argues for some extreme form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or the sort of linguistic determinism that states that one can only perceive what one's own language will allow one to perceive. It seems at times that Butler believes that people would not perceive the distinction male and female if not for the fact that we have been trained to do so by the language that we speak, or that they speak. In a passage with a tone more evocative of Foucault and with her hallmark obscurity, she claims that biological sex, quote, is not a simple fact or static condition of a body, but a process whereby regulatory norms materialize sex and achieve this materialization through a forcible reiteration of those norms, end quote. This curious process called materialization that somehow creates dimorphic sex, or at least the illusion of it, a process that Butler describes in great detail, yet with no real clarity, allows her to undermine any sense of matter or a material body as we know it. And I would argue that in her assault on matter, she betrays an issue with mother, given that these two words appear so inextricably related. Dismissing sex in this fashion allows Butler to introduce a key idea that has taken hold of the collective imagination. The idea is this: gender is a performance and nothing but performance. Stripped of its academic attire and stated with maximum economy, one could say that for Butler, gender is what you pretend to be, and pretending makes things real. Just as J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, said of his fictional protagonist that, to him, make-believe and true were exactly the same thing, one might say these words of Butler as well. Both Peter Pan and Butler share the same thesis: to pretend makes things real. In Neverland, Peter Pan even grows literally fat by eating imaginary food. Something similar is at work in Butler's conception of gender. It would appear that one can literally become the other gender by pretending that one already is. For von Franz, this confusion of real and imaginary worlds is a result of the mother complex. With such thoughts in mind, it is no surprise that in the realm of Neverland, there is great ambivalence regarding the issue of mothers. Peter Pan, in fact, all of the lost boys of which he is the leader, both long for mothers and deny they need them. I think Butler has an equally great ambivalence regarding the question of matter. She both accepts and denies the reality of the material body. She denies the material reality of sex, though she first uses it to define gender, only to later proceed to use gender to deny sex, or something like that. It's all kind of a muddle. Perhaps that is the point. Regardless, once sex is no longer grounded in matter, understood as an epistemological starting point, gender is no longer grounded in sex. On the contrary, bodies assume sex, as Butler says, in agreement with regulatory social norms entrenched by a heterosexual imperative. Threats of punishment for homosexual desire and the pervasiveness of the heterosexual ideal work together to sex bodies. Yet Butler reassures her reader that the category, this is a quote, the category of women does not become useless through deconstruction, but becomes one whose uses are no longer reified as reference, and which stand a chance of being opened up, indeed, of coming to signify in ways that none of us can predict in advance, end quote. So the term women, having been deconstructed, can still have a meaning, but no one can predict what that meaning might become. No one can know what the term women will refer to. This is, in a sense, both absurd and prescient, given that few would have predicted at the time of publication of Butler's words just cited that the question, what is a woman, would have come to the forefront of academic and political debate. Yet the question, what is a woman, is certainly at the forefront of both political and academic discussion at this very moment. It is the title of an online documentary film by conservative commentator Matt Walsh, philosopher Kathleen Stock, whose book Material Girls offers an excellent counter-argument to queer theory and gender theory influenced by Butler, resigned from her position as professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex in 2021 under political pressure resulting from her views. That same year, journalist Helen Joyce published her book, Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, which was greeted to significant commercial success. The book addresses this same question of what a woman is and isn't, and clearly sets out the dramatic cultural and legal implications of the denial of biological reality and its reduction to social construction. The academic Germaine Greer, a major figure in second wave radical feminism, defied a campaign to prevent her from speaking at Cardiff University precisely because she dared to take issue with the redefining of the word woman. One way of thinking about the debate surrounding the question, what is a woman, a debate that could not have existed even a few short years ago, is to acknowledge that to deconstruct the gender binary or to deconstruct the sex binary is to deconstruct one of the most foundational and one of the most archetypal binaries in human thought. Because he considered it so foundational in Jung psychology, this binary has a name of its own, syzygy, which Jung uses to refer to the masculine and feminine principles that are bound together in the human psyche. Because it is so foundational, the issue of gender also attracts the ire of those antagonistic to foundations and binaries. Because it is so self-evident, the sex binary of male and female is anathema to those who question the very concept of the self-evident. It is perhaps in the arena of gender and sex that the eternal youth's qualms with both the primordial mother and the temporal father are most apparent, because the gender binary and the sex binary epitomize the ineradicable dualism that this figure so fiercely opposes. I'm going to skip a short little bit of my presentation just because we're a little bit running over time and come right to the conclusion. What I have tried to do today is to give at least some sense of the way in which one might use a Jungian hermeneutics as a way of attending to the images and the ideas, the fantasies and the facts, the dreams and the reasons, the myths and the meanings, the archetypes and the arguments, and the complexes and the concepts, to use Robert Romanishen's words again. Put differently, I have tried to give a taste of how one might treat philosophical ideas in a way that is not merely philosophical, but rather grounded in the insights of depth psychology and myth. This is an approach that attempts to discern the symbolic dimension in everything. In doing so, I have looked for what these authors, Derrida and Butler, might be saying without quite knowing that they're saying it, what patterns they might be expressing without quite being aware of the fact themselves, including patterns that Jungians might call archetypal, that is to say, patterns that are both archaic and typical, patterns that are not only current but recurrent. As Jung did when looking at scientific hypotheses, when reading Derrida and Butler, I have assumed that their works mean something quite different than they appear to. Proceeding in this way is important because it allows us to return ideas to their psychological, archetypal ground. Then their symptomatic and symbolic content can be engaged because their more fully human origin has been acknowledged. Abstract ideas, then, are no longer seen merely as abstract ideas. Rather, one can see behind the ideas, behind the conflicting arguments and logical contradictions. One can see what might make a person cling with that irrational zeal to one claim or another. Returning ideas to this psychic ground was Jung's, Hillman's, and von Franz's approach. The failure to return ideas to this archetypal context obscures psyche. Then we are left with the brilliant opining of savants, and both Derrida and Butler are brilliant in their own way, but the archetypal narratives that possess them remain shrouded. Thank you very much. I would love to take questions.
Thank you, Bret. And the floor is open for questions. If you would use the raise hand function or raise your hand on screen, that would be awesome. Thank you. Peter?
Hey, Bret, that was great. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
If we assume simply the veracity of your argument, which I mean, it resonates so immediately and deeply. If I think I'm getting it, then it seems like it has several implications that have immediate potency, such as, has there been some neglect of the great mother by the political left? And is there a way of using that to meet the threat represented by authoritarianism?
Well, that's great. I think so. I really do think so. It's a little bit hard to really flesh that out in detail, which is in part why I wrote a book, because you get to do that when you're writing a book in detail. But you know, if we think of things related to this image of the Great Mother, and we think of myths of the eternal youth and the Great Mother, there's always a very ambivalent dynamic of the eternal youth with that mother. There's a lot of both attachment and denial of the attachment. There's and I think you can see this coming through in aspects of the political left and authoritarianism on the left. Without a doubt. The short answer is yes. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about it, and that might give me a chance to riff with a little more alacrity on that.
And I'll try to do it in a sentence, but I have no faith in current day conservatism to bring about environmental or social justice, which means I feel myself dependent on progressivism. And yet progressivism is shooting itself in the foot through its deconstruction of power structures and its neglect of matter, and now your extension of that into the mother.
Yeah. I mean, as soon as you start deconstructing things like nature, which is a big target of deconstruction, then you start making arguments that really serve to alienate us from our natural environment, alienate us from the environment, and you get a form of environmental activism that is in many ways antithetical to truly embracing nature. I think, you know, movements like, you know, Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, they're environmental movements, but there's something that's profoundly anti-environmentalist about it, in the sense that they tend to just think of humans as being not even really animals, just like every other animal. It's fundamentally different than the vision of, for example, a person like Andy Fisher, who wrote an amazing book called Radical Eco-Psychology, which is a great, it's a great book that really makes a point of conceiving human beings as a part of the natural environment. You know, we're just as much animal as every other animal. And this is a fact that I think is being really, really denied by certain aspects of the political left. And I'll go so far as to say, part of that denial, I think, is a denial of sexual dimorphism and just the brute reality of, you know, we're a sexually dimorphic species. And any even talks of things like intersex really don't discredit the idea. So there's a whole aspect of, you know, certain types of thinkers who are just in denial about our relationship to the Great Mother, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Joshua.
All right. Bret, I wanted to say thank you for this talk. Absolutely fascinating and, like Peter said, very timely. So, you know, the irony of being so opposed to oppressive, you know, social constructs that you then create your own oppressive social construct that would, you know, culminate in forcing someone like Kathleen Stock out of her position based on, you know, criticizing these sacred cows, so to speak. You know, that irony is not lost on me. And it seems like, you know, when you mention this idea of, you know, what is the God that exists for this person in their ideology or their philosophy or their theory, you know, calls to mind that that anecdote about Freud that Jung shared of, you know, him being so committed to his irreligiosity that he created a dogma, right?
Yep.
It's like whatever we're most opposed to is what ends up showing up for us. And you know, I think there is some wisdom in this idea of not discussing politics or religion at the Thanksgiving table, right? So it just seems like it's clear that if someone has taken this unipolar principle and made it like ultimate in their psychic hierarchy and their understanding of the world, they've elevated it to the position of a god. That, you know, that seems true, it seems apparent, but that also seems problematic. And I'm just curious if you have any sense from Jung's work of what is the way forward, right? Because clearly he was going to make no headway with Freud on trying to dissuade him from, you know, his deification of the sexual principle. And likewise, I just wonder if you have any sense of, okay, so if these sorts of ideological factors have become gods for people, where do we go from here?
Well, you know, Jung writes a fair amount about ideological possession, and I think for him that means at the same time writing about archetypal possession. And so, I mean, the first thing you do is you identify it. You identify, okay, it seems like this, you know, particular person or this particular form of thought is so irrationally entrenched, so dogmatically attached to a particular idea that they are in effect worshiping a particular god. The first thing is just to call it out. So and say, okay, so you're working within a particular mythological framework, you know? And, you know, and at that point, if somebody just is utterly denies it, I think that's sort of a tell, you know? And so, you know, what I've done in the book is really just do that. It's not so much that I'm saying that deconstruction is something that's utterly of no value, or that these particular thinkers have no value, as much as I'm saying that to the extent that they become dogmatically fixated on particular principles, we can locate them in a particular mythology. If I was looking at a different set of thinkers, I might say, wow, you're really possessed by the Senex archetype. Like and I might associate that with like a dramatically super uber conservative point of view that just says, the Bible should be taken literally. It's the word of God. There is no other particular way of conceiving of this. That would be one way of just looking at a particular set of beliefs and saying, well, it exists within a mythological structure, and one that's particularly rigid, and one that, if you call it out, tends to evoke the same things that you evoke when you touch upon someone's complex. There are certain things that people might say to me that might really piss me off, might really hurt me. And when that happens, when I'm at my best, I think, okay, just got triggered. I've got some sort of complex going on here. And maybe I can pull back and sort of look at it. And something similar needs to happen, I think, in the broader cultural sphere, when we're seeing people get so enraged by particular discussions of ideas. We have to recognize, okay, that's a psychological complex. I know it because I know what the the tells of a psychological complex are. People get super sensitive. They start to vilify and demonize others. They start all of a sudden you start to see these weird projective dynamics. So when you start to identify things, if you're following a Jungian way of thinking, you say, well, where there's a complex, there's an archetypal narrative going on in some form or another. And just doing that helps to relativize the thinking. All of a sudden, deconstruction isn't just this sort of natural, absolute thing that we do. It's like, oh, no, you're kind of in a deconstructive mentality right now. I can see that. And just naming it helps to recontextualize it. I hope that makes sense. Cool. Thank you. That was a great question, Joshua. As was Peter's.
Okay. So Barbara, you have the floor, but your microphone is still off.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you so much, Bret. And hello to old friends, Peter and Robert. It's been a long time since we've been in the same conference together, so it's just a pleasure. Just to add to what you've just said, Bret, thanks so much. This has been very rich. Maybe another way to approach this last question is to have Foucault come in with identifying the discourse, so that one isn't talking all the time about, well, what is something, but one can talk about, well, how is it being spoken about? What is the discourse?
Sure. I mean, that makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting because there are some similarities in the way that I approach things and the way that people like Derrida and even Foucault approach things. I think the difference is when I identify the discourse, I start to look for the archetypal parallels. I start to look for the myth, right?
Sure.
I start to look for which, Foucault might say the meta-narrative. I tend to think of these meta-narratives as being part of the human psyche, part of the very nature of what it means to be human. And I think, Foucault has a different approach, but I think you're right in the sense of just pointing out the discourse, how it's being used, what context it springs from is an important element.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Do we have any other questions, comments?
It just seems that, Bret, that riffing off of the idea of a meta-narrative, that if we deconstruct the deconstructivist's meta-narrative, that there is not a meta-narrative, and if we actually pray to the gods and goddesses that bring us deconstruction, and if we see the 20th century as profoundly successful at the deconstruction of the meta-narratives of the patriarchy, then aren't we on the brink of obligating ourselves to construct a new narrative for the sake of our own sanity and our care for the environment?
Yeah, I mean, the impulse to deconstruct all meta narratives, which I think has really, really taken hold of a large swath of the culture and population, that impulse to me is the eternal youth impulse. I mean, the eternal youth wants to say, everything that's come before me is just a bunch of, it's just what the old people say. There's like, there's nothing, there's no there to it. It's kind of like, it's just what they used to believe, but I know better. And that attitude has its place. But like with any attitude, is if it's your default, and if the only thing you can do is deconstruct, you arrive at a pretty dark place. I think that's kind of a short road to nihilism, and it's also a short road to political activism that is misguided, doesn't make sense. I think one way of thinking about this is that deconstruction has its place, which is, for me to say that, it means a lot because I have railed against this particular line of thinking for quite a while. But it has its place. If it's archetypal in some sense, then it has a purpose and a belonging, right? And we can deconstruct. We can look at received ideas and say, well, this isn't true, or it's not true in the same way that our ancestors might have thought about it, and we can rethink it and come up with new ways of thinking. But if we're utterly possessed by the impulse to deconstruct, then construction has no place. Which, I mean, that's I don't think that's a tenable. For one, I don't think it's a tenable philosophical position to just deconstruct all the time. And I don't think it's a psychologically healthy position either. Yeah. I hope I addressed what you're saying.
Oh, I'm with you.
Okay. I'm open for more questions. I know we're a little bit actually running over, but
at the risk of going on, I mean, if we think of the deconstruction as a deconstruction of the spectator theory of knowing, that we know something outside of us through passive observation, then if we go back to American transcendentalism and its idea that we engage in truth seeking as an activity that leads to a result, not as a pursuit of a pre-existing condition, then it seems like we can return to William James' energy of wanting to create in the world, for which deconstruction is one phase of the creating process, but not the only phase.
Yeah, and I think that's well said, and I go into that in the book, and in doing so, I reference Stanton Marlin a bit, because Stanton Marlin is written a lot about deconstruction. He has a particular way of writing about it, and he associates deconstruction with particular phases in alchemy, like the nigredo, the putrefactio, and I think he's right to do so. And then what I like about his framing is that then you're construing it as one element in a process, right? And that's what deconstruction doesn't do for itself. It doesn't understand that it's just one element, one step in an interpretive process, in a hermeneutic process. It doesn't like deconstruct and then say, okay, now we're going to start, finding again meaning. So, I mean, I think that's spot on. And I go to it in quite a bit of detail in the book, bringing in a thinker that I haven't mentioned today, which is Merleau-Ponty, the French phenomenologist, because I think he is a wonderful person who's simultaneously able to see to what degree a deconstructive approach makes sense and has validity, but then he also sees what the missing element is. So for me, he's a thinker that really helps to integrate aspects of deconstructive thought that are just dissociated. Yeah. That's it.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Bret. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was just here. I was just thinking about Bret's and Peter's conversation. It sounds very liberation psychology to me. It's more on the socio-historical political spectrum, right? The idea of deconstruction, but then coming together to reconstruct new society values, etc. Except in liberation psychology, what usually happens is that what's being deconstructed are the values and idea of the dominant group. And yeah, I suppose that's just leading me to think that if we deconstruct and reconstruct, unless we do something different, it will always be in favor of the dominant group's deals.
Yeah.
So your association with liberation psychology is perfect, because there's an image of the reconstruction based on a return to our humanity and our shared responsibility to one another. That's beautiful.
Peter, you make me want to come back to class. As one that's already finished, I'm like, is Peter teaching this? Do I need to go and say, may I re-enroll?
But you just mentioned something, Peter, that's so important to me, and it's the idea of shared humanity. And this is what I think is really undermined by a strictly deconstructive approach, is that it leaves no area for understanding like shared commonality between cultures, between, it's like there's no sense of the universal, the idea that, yes, we're different from one another. There's big cultural differences. There's differences in historical epochs, but at the same time, human is human, and we all share the same human nature, even though we might construe that nature in different languages. They might get expressed in different ways, but fundamentally, I mean, we're kindred. Yeah.
There's a wonderful new book. As an introverted thinking type, it's dangerous for me to be near my bookshelf, so forgive me. But this
I keep mine far away.
Yeah. Zoom is a dangerous thing. But this is 2021 cultural anthropology at its best, asking the question, what are the origins of inequality? And what they claim is that civilization is only civilization when there are women in leadership, when we gather in small bands that focus on the caring for one another. That what we have here is not a civilization, it's a failure of civilization that must be deconstructed. And then with some idea of liberation theology and psychology guiding us, a return to the matriarch sufficient that we learn how to care for one another again. We do it in the small groups, whether at Pacifica or here at the IAJS, that creates the new narrative.
I don't have anything to add to that, but that sounds like a book that should be on my bookshelf as well.
Oh, it's a great read.
Well, thank you, Bret. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who showed up.
Yeah, absolutely. So please watch your email for more emails coming out about our upcoming talks. I don't know if it's Sonia or someone that's sending out. We've been in discussion about what's coming out in the next couple of days or so. So thank you all. It's been a very rich experience this morning. And again, Bret, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, for sharing with us this morning. And thank you all for your presence. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Okay.
Bernie and Sonia,
Thank you, Bret.
Bernie and Sonia, thanks so much to you for contributing your volunteer time to the IAJS. I know that's really consuming, and the fruits of your labor are right here today. So thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that, Peter. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye all.